So I am 99% sure that most of you have heard of Jonathan Swift, whereas I am probably 80% sure most of you have never heard of Alexander Pope, who, if Jonathan Swift is the greatest prose satire writer to come out of the 18th century, Alexander Pope is the greatest satirist for poetry. And he was this real central figure for the neoclassical movement of the early 18th century. He is remembered as the first full-time professional English writer, having supported himself largely on subscription fees for his popular translations of Homer and his edition of the works of William Shakespeare. And he is really recognized as a great formal master, an eloquent expositor of the spirit of his age, and a representative of the culture and politics of the Enlightenment. Pope was born on May 21st, 1688, to a wealthy Catholic linen merchant. Alexander Pope, because he was Catholic, because remember, I mean, that it would probably make him a kind of social pariah of his age. And because Catholics, I mean, he suffered prejudices all his life, not only because he was Catholic, but as you'll see, he was kind of deformed, which I'll tell you about in just a second. So, because Catholics were forbidden to hold office, practice their religion, attend public schools, or live within 10 miles of England, Pope grew up in nearby Windsor Forest and was mostly self-taught. His education, supplemented by study with private tutors or priests, and at the age of 12, he contracted spinal tuberculosis, which left him with a permanent physical disability. He never grew taller than 4.5 feet, was hunchbacked, and required daily care throughout adulthood. His irascible nature and unpopularity in the press are often attributed to three factors: his membership in a religious minority, his physical infirmity, and his exclusion from formal education. However, Pope was bright, precocious, and determined, and by his teens was writing accomplished verse. His rise to fame kind of come with his first published work, an essay on criticism that he writes at the age of 23. And because of this publication, he becomes friends with the great writers of the age, nominally Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, the editors of The Spectator, who published his essays and poems, and the appearance of The Rape of the Lock made him famous in wider circles. He was also friends with John Gay, John Dryden, and John Swift. So, anyways, the Pope is also considered to be a misogynist. He's not a great fan of women, probably because, and I hate to say it this way, and don't throw stones at me for saying this, but I think that he had issues with women because he was unpopular with them. And also, unlike someone like Jonathan Swift, who writes from this kind of political point of view, Pope wrote for and about the aristocratic circles. His literature was something that the things that he wrote was more geared toward people who had education, who could understand the subtleties of his style, and he wrote to make fun of and chastise those that were in his readership. So that is certainly the case with The Rape of the Lock, which If you remember back to our second unit, or our first unit, sorry, gosh, it's been a while, with our dear Chanticleer and his Nun's Priest Tale, Chaucer's Nun's Priest Tale, that was an example of a mock epic. And The Rape of the Lock, just so, is also considered to be a mock epic, which, if you remember, is a work designed to ridicule attitude, style, or subject matter by handling either an elevated subject in a trivial manner or a low subject with mock dignity. In other words, he is not making fun of necessarily the epic as a genre, but the people that make up his story. If you remember again, that an epic is a long poem where we focus on the adventure of a hero or a war, where there is an invocation of the muse, an interference by gods in human affairs, a great battle scene, and a rape of female chastity is certainly one of those things. And Pope, in The Rape of the Lock, really mimics those conventions, mainly with this kind of hero of Belinda as this character who is arming herself for battle, or going into the social scene with her elaborate dress. This kind of supernatural element of the sylphs, who will talk about her journey to the underworld, or the goddess of spleen, which we won't get to because I'm not asking you guys to read and the whole thing, but the card game as this mighty battle and this voyage that we will read on the River Thames. So you'll see that in our poem, but it's essential that you guys realize that this is a mock epic and Belinda is our hero. Anyways, some background information on our poem is that it is based on a true story. Basically, what happens is that there is this dispute between two Anglo-Catholic families. Lord Petre cuts off a lock of hair from an Arabella Fermor, or farmer as it's pronounced, and she and her family become really angry at this. And Pope, as a Catholic himself, wrote the poem at the suggestion of his friend John Carlyle, to pour poetic oils on the troubled waters, to try to make peace between the families. There were so few Catholics in England that they really needed to kind of stick together, and he really wants to hope, or the hope was that by writing this kind of epic, and if you notice that there's a letter at the beginning, and it mentions all of these things, that they can see that this is really not an earth-shattering ordeal, and they'll kind of laugh at each other and themselves. But the poem was a popular success. However, Arabella was not too happy at being mocked, which you can imagine. But it is based on a true story, and it is about The Rape of the Lock is about a man stealing hair from another woman. So through this mock epic, Pope satires a couple of things. He's looking at the aristocratic class, or London society, their social mores, specifically of the upper class, beauty regimes of women, vain women, and to a lesser degree, vain men, this kind of war between the sexes, and London society interests in the kind of supernatural and the celebrity culture. But in the grand scheme of things, like I said earlier, Pope is a misogynist, and if you think about it, if from a modern point of view, all men during the 18th century were misogynists. but he is um, making fun of women, um, and what Pope considers the kind of trivial concerns. And um, some themes in this poem, as we shall see, nominally the battle of the sexes, between men and women, between Belinda and the Baron, but also I think in some ways the kind of competitive nature of the marriage market, when we see Belinda's frenemy Clarissa, human experiences being involved, and the effects of moral values, and also this kind of trivial versus meaningful manners. And that's kind of where we are for this week in terms of what we're reading, who we're reading, and the kind of various modes of satire of the 18th century. So for this week, I would like for you to read A Modest Proposal. And for those of you who have already read it before, skim back through it, and we're going to talk about it. And The Rape of the Lock, Cantos 1, 2, and 3. And a majority of our conversation is going to be spent talking about The Rape of the Lock, because I am going to assume that most of you all are unfamiliar with that reading, whereas A Modest Proposal is something that you guys have probably read, or at least heard of before. So that's where we're at. We're going to have our conversation again this week, which I'm really excited about. And please, please, please make sure that you read closely, take notes on what you read, ask questions, and I'm looking forward to what you guys have to say about both Swift and Pope and their various, albeit different, approaches to satirical writing.